sales effectiveness has a direct correlation with the amount of time spent in selling activities. There's a link between quantity of time with buyers and quality of time with buyers. They are not separatable. So if you want to improve the quality of time with your buyers, and by the way, there's a whole separate webinar about that. You've got a link there in your attachments file. I did that just earlier today based on B2B buyer research. If you want to increase that quality, though, the first thing you have to do is find more time to spend with buyers. Quantity first, quality second, because rushed sellers simply don't do their best work. And how could they if they're racing through a sales call? What we're going to talk about in this presentation are the insidious time wasters and the time stealers that I observe most frequently as I field coach sales professionals. Let me just take a tangent here to tell you who I am. I'm Deb Calvert. I have worked in sales my entire career. For the past 20 years, I've been conducting buyer-side research, working to understand what it is that buyers want sellers to do in order to select them and to remain long-term customers with them. I do a lot of field coaching. As I'm interviewing buyers, I'm observing sellers, and I'm paying very close attention to what it is that leads to sales effectiveness. So that's what this particular presentation is all about. It's about being able to increase the quality of each and every sales engagement with a buyer because you have enough time to be able to do that. If you would, please take a look at the attachments tab. I'll be offering you a lot of free takeaways from this webinar. One of the things that you'll see there is at the top a link to the Connect community. That's where, beyond today's webinar, you can interact with me and with the entire team here at People First Productivity Solutions. We are building and supplying new tools all the time to help you with sales productivity, and I invite you to join us there. Today's topic is about finding enough, making enough, protecting enough time to be effective in selling. This scary little number on screen, I have to point out to you that's an average. Some are spending more, and some are spending even less than a third of their time actually selling. And I don't think that's okay in most sales organizations. Here's why it matters, for a lot of reasons. One of the first reasons is that salespeople who are the top performers have time to do things differently. There is that direct link to sales performance. We have to remember and remind ourselves that time is a non-renewable resource. We never, ever get it back. The top performers in any organization, they do a pretty good job of protecting their time and wisely investing their time. Unfortunately, many well-intended sales managers make it difficult for sellers to guard their time. And part of this is a trickle-down effect. Sales managers themselves are spread way too thin. They are inadvertently pushing sellers to do things that aren't quite helpful when it comes to making numbers. They're accidentally piling onto sellers some things that interfere with selling time. This graphic may be a little hard to read on screen if you have your window minimized, but if you'd like a copy of this graphic, it's in the attachments file right here on the Bright Talk screen. And if you want more information about this, about what sales managers ought to do more of, less of, and delegate to other departments to do instead, take a look at my LinkedIn post. There's a LinkedIn post all about this. And another really great resource that talks about this a lot is Mike Weinberg's book, Sales Management Simplified. If you haven't seen that one before, please do go in and get a copy. All right, so our topic, though. With all that in the background, we know some of those things are unavoidable. We still have to find a way to appropriately manage sellers' time. So I want to talk about 6 things. I want to talk about these 6 things because what we are asking our sellers to do has a direct impact on how well they can sell. Tasks assigned make great places to hide and can cause reps and even sales managers to truly believe there's no time left for prospecting and other sales activities. So these 6 culprits, I'll take them one by one. They all seem to sneak in. They take up more time than was originally intended. And the reason for that is that they do have an appropriate time and place. They have to stay in the mix. We can't get rid of them entirely, but we have to be very thoughtful and balanced. It's kind of like dieting. You can't do without food, but you have to be selective and you have to be thoughtful about the appropriate mix. It's this balance, the imbalance, that becomes problematic. Now, I'm not suggesting that you could or should put a complete moratorium on any of these. This is instead about being more aware so that you can invest the time appropriately and make sure that people aren't getting too far off track. I'll take these one by one, starting with training right there at the top, and you might be surprised to see a sales trainer say that training could be a total waste of time. And I am talking about all types of training that sellers have to attend: product training, process training, systems training, cross-functional training to get business acumen, and even selling skills training. These are all a complete waste of time unless you have limited distractions and good coverage of accounts so that the sellers can focus on the training. It's a total waste of time if you've picked the wrong time of year or the wrong time of day and people can't focus. It's a waste of time if it's a grind and there's too much piled into too little a window of time. They can't absorb it all. And if they can't apply it immediately, and if the rest of the staff hasn't been equipped to support whatever it is that's the intended outcome of training, you're going to find that it's just not going to be suitable. So think about timing. You know, sales training actually can hurt sales. Obviously, you take people out of the field, there's going to be a little dip in sales. And then when they come out of the training and they're struggling to apply what they've learned and they're calibrating it with whatever else they used to do, right, there's some struggle there, some learning. That learning curve is going to have a negative temporary effect, hopefully, on sales. And if you are not reinforcing whatever's been trained, there's going to be some confusion, some frustration, and that's what will actually impair sales the longest. So we have to be pretty careful about all the things we do. We have to be really thoughtful about timing. Another way that training can be a complete waste of time and maybe even a complete waste of money or good money thrown after bad timing, it's this. These are considerations. As you offer or evaluate sales training, be sure to analyze what you're about to offer to your team. Avoid at all costs the pedagogical approach of yesteryear. If the training is overly formal or dogmatic, if the instructor is inflexible, all of those things will cause the training to have limited impact and for people to have negative reactions to it. This type of style, pedagogical, it doesn't work in modern adult learning. In fact, it doesn't really even work in elementary schools all that well anymore. Instead, your training needs to be learner-focused and highly customized and very interactive and in the moment if it's to be effective. Not only that, but your reinforcement, as I said a moment ago, your reinforcement has to be right. Post-training matters a lot. The sales manager bears this responsibility, and if the sales manager is unable to attend, to reinforce, and to model what was learned, I advise that you skip the training altogether. There is an infographic, I put a few in there for you, but another infographic in your attachments that talks about some practical ways to reinforce sales training. So if you're thinking about sales training, take all of this into account. Be sure to think about your role in reinforcing, and here's why. See, that manager role in reinforcement, it makes a huge difference. What you see there on the left-hand side, that's the actual training event. The lower line, the one that's brownish red in color, that's poor preparation and poor delivery, and the higher, the blue line, that signifies your best case, your learning effectiveness. So really good training can get you some lift, but look what happens after training. That's where the gap gets even bigger over there on the right side, and it's the manager. The reinforcement from the sales manager and the sales organization that really makes the biggest difference. That happens after the workshop. You get a 2/3 or more increase in the effectiveness of your training when you have really good, not only preparation and delivery, but reinforcement for after training. So I can't say it enough. Don't waste time on poorly executed training that won't be reinforced. It's that simple. Okay, culprit number 2. This one is about administrative tasks, and please notice that I've included the CRM and other sales enablement tools in this second culprit. Obviously, not all of those things are bad. There's a lot of good, a lot of benefit when they're used wisely and when they're used in balance. There's a separate webinar here on this channel about disabling sales if you think things here might be out of balance in your organization, or if you're looking for some ways to do that evaluation. But administrative tasks, getting them all in balance, there are some pretty big implications here, including this one, another big ouch. Is that what you're really intending? Do you want there to be 10 or 11 hours a week spent on reports and paperwork? Now, in all fairness, we ought to look at this from multiple perspectives. Sales managers want and need reports to track performance and activity standards, to satisfy senior management, to complete their own internal reporting, and so on. And senior sales directors, they want and they need reports too, so they can stay plugged into the action and minimize any surprises. And even team members want the sales reports that are going to affect their workload or have an impact on the part of the business that they're responsible for. And these are all valid reasons. But it's a slippery slope, and it's easy to get carried away. So you have to think about this. On any given day, how many minutes do you want each of your sellers to spend on entering data so someone else can use it? And how often have you asked? No, let me restate that. How often have you examined how every report is generated and used by others? Because chances are there are some essential and then maybe even some totally useless reports that are floating around. Your sellers may be compiling and entering information that's frivolous. So I'll give you an example. A couple years back, the weekly expense report required by one company had 42 fields to be completed on this expense report. So I asked the finance people a lot of questions. I asked them what was the purpose for gathering information like the taxi driver's board licensing number. And after a few half-hearted attempts at defending those required fields, they did revise the form, so there were now just 10 simple fields to enter. I was going for 5. We ended up with 10. But can you imagine, right? 32 fields were eliminated. Can you imagine just how much time that would save for every single seller, multiplied by every seller every week? Whatever you can do, those little things, they add up. Whatever you can do to minimize, to streamline, even to eradicate reports and paperwork that are disabling sales, do it. Reclaim every minute that you can for sales, customer-facing type work. Here are some thought starters, some questions to help you begin to look at this. And you can use these questions. First, you'll have to get a little candid with yourself, but you can use these questions to audit your own practices about how sellers' time is spent in administrative tasks. You may wish to engage a sales productivity consultant to help you identify what's really going on. If so, just shoot me an email. And I understand that some may be feeling a little bit defensive as I challenge you to consider these practices that are on screen. So I have to ask, just between you and me, what are you defending? Is it a legacy practice that may not be as important today as it used to be? Is it the systems the company spent big bucks on? Do you feel the need to require time with the tool because the tool was so expensive? Be careful, because that time spent is time wasted if it doesn't produce clear revenue growth, cause and effect. Or maybe what you're defending is your own time, right? If the sellers do something, you won't have to do it. Check yourself on this, because freeing up sellers' time to sell is, or ought to be, one of your primary priorities. Or for anybody who feels like the sales VP I'm currently coaching, yes, some of your meetings are pointless. Don't let your ego be the main driver of a meeting agenda. If the time spent in meetings won't have a direct and positive impact on your seller's attaining goal, consider not meeting at all. And think about what you're asking sellers to do. Whatever you're asking them to do needs to have a big enough payoff in terms of that top-line revenue that it's worth sacrificing time on selling activities that would produce that top-line revenue. Here's another one. Is this something, this interpreting of sales reports, is this something you really want or need sellers to do? Because here's what I see. I see an awful lot of sales managers redoing this work every single time. They have the sellers do it, they receive it from the sellers, and they start from scratch and redo it themselves. So why require it of sellers in the first place? All you really need from them is probably the narrative, without any excuses. So to get good disclosure, time spent on discussing the variables that will impact future revenue, and then being able to coach and proactively create contingency plans so there's high value for them to tell you about what's going on with the leading indicators. You're getting the story, you'll put together the numbers, and you'll do a better job of it as opposed to them doing it and you redoing it. Now, as I said a moment ago, your job is to enable sales by clearing barriers. And the very biggest impact a sales manager can make will come from getting rid of sacred cows, challenging the status quo processes and procedures that are in place, that the limitations that are imposed by those every once in a while ought to be inspected. An exercise that you can use is to evaluate a day in the life of a salesperson. And as you do that, ask this single question. And if you're a frontline seller, ask this question about your own selling day frequently, at least once a month. But ask this question about every single activity. How much does this activity contribute in driving top-line revenue? And ask it with impunity. Declutter your mind so you're not filtering the answers with a lot of yeah buts. And don't let the pressures from non-selling entities encroach on this question. We already know that someone at some time felt that every one of these activities was relevant and important or useful. That's not the question that you're looking at in this evaluation. You can come back to those justifications later. But first, start with a pure look at the central question that you see there on screen. And you can keep this simple. Just answer a lot, a little, or not at all. And when you take a look at how many things you have in the not at all or the bucket that you're calling a little, that's where you know you got to focus on switching, taking some of those off your plate, off the seller's plate, so that more time can be spent on sales, direct selling activities. Well, let's move on to culprit number 3. This one's tricky because, of course, you want to be cooperative with other departments, and you want sales to have input with marketing, QA, supply chain, production, shipping, and so on, but at what cost? I think this is tricky also because we are getting more and more buyers, more and more decision makers involved on the buyer side. In fact, the CEB says it's now 6.4 in complex sales. So with that, with more people lined up over there on the buyer team, we're needing more internal support from our own internal subject matter experts too. But a seller could spend a lot of time internally if this gets out of balance. And I think there's also a trickle-down effect here because, once again, there's something happening with sales managers that's significant, something that we really have to consider because it has implications for sellers too. So take a look at what you see here. See, it used to be that sales management in the triangle decade or 2 decades ago, it was all about persuasion, account planning, team building, and interpersonal skills. That's what it took to be a good sales manager. Today, though, there's even more a sales manager has to do. Strategic planning, staff development. You have to have great financial acumen to run numbers and to make forecasts. And not only that, but you have to be a good change manager and an excellent collaborator. And if you want to move into senior sales management, or if that's where you already sit, on top of everything I've named, you also need some additional high-level skills, great degree of business acumen. You need to know about information management and leadership. And what's emerging for everybody there in the ovals at the bottom, even more, 6 additional areas where management is being taxed and management is being asked to learn and do more and more in all of these areas. So the implications for sellers, the trickle down, well, if these are your skills in sales management, then they aren't just tasks, they're skills. And since you're expected to know these things, your organization quite likely expects some of the same from sellers too. And any seller who aspires to sales management is having to demonstrate all of these different elements in order to have a shot. Let me say it another way. You, sales managers and sellers, spend a lot of time doing and a lot of time learning outside the traditional function of simply selling. Here's one thought. If you're looking for a way to be able to move beyond this or to get some help with this, here's something to consider. This is what used to be a traditional relationship. We're going to call this the butterfly relationship. The place where the two companies meet, yours and your buyers, in the middle, it's with the buyer and the seller. And you, the seller, in your organization, you go off and talk to all of the other departments inside your company to make things happen, and you bring that back and you report to the buyer. The buyer then goes and reports out and gets information and brings it back to you from inside his or her own organization. Well, this isn't very efficient, especially at a time when we have 6.4 decision makers, because you have 6.4 different butterflies to look at and one seller doing all of that. So we can flip this. You know, butterflies are actually very fragile. This is so fragile that if a single buyer leaves, or if the seller leaves your organization, this entire relationship falls apart. So we can flip this around. Instead of a butterfly, what we want to have instead is a diamond relationship. A diamond relationship makes the seller and the buyer facilitators. They bring together the functions within their own organizations and get them talking to each other. Because you know that the people in your operations department or in your IT department, they can talk the language. They can have deeper level conversations with their peers over in the buyer's organization. And when you form multiple functional type relationships, what you have is this diamond construct, and diamonds are strong. Now it's not up to the buyer and the seller to do all of the interpreting and all of the communicating and all of the other in-between steps. Now you have direct relationships and strong bonds that withstand a single person leaving the organization. And as you leverage all of that knowledge base inside your organization, you also create a much, much better buyer experience. So this is good for the sales organization, frees up the seller's time, and engages the buyer at an entirely different level. This is smart business. Well, we got to talk about other things that are happening in the organization that encroach on the seller's time. This culprit of having to work with other departments. Another place where it gets out of balance is that there are sometimes so many meetings. You'd like to have sales be represented at all of them. It's just probably not possible. Hopefully, by distributing the workload with a diamond relationship, your sellers won't need to go to as many meetings as they likely attend internally today. That would be the aim, so that they can instead invest that time prospecting new buyers, serving buyers that they already work with, doing more in the true selling vein. The fourth culprit, I have to be a little careful how I phrase this one. I don't want to offend anybody, but I work with enough SMBs to know this is a real and growing problem there. And I also see this with larger and more sophisticated sales organizations, even when there are ample numbers of people dedicated to doing this work of developing sales materials. A big reason why it happens is that sellers aren't handing off the tasks that they could be. See, some sellers, those with call reluctance, they choose busy work over selling work. And then we've got a whole other group of sellers, they just don't trust others to do the work of developing proposals, of tailoring marketing materials, of partnering to prepare for demos, and so forth. And then we've got sellers, you know exactly who I'm talking about, who procrastinate, and they don't allow enough time to get support. Working at the last minute forces them to be a solo act. And then in some organizations, well, the support team has also already gotten maxed out, or worse yet, the support team got trimmed to save expenses. That, by the way, is another slippery slope. If you're sacrificing revenue by getting sellers to do work that saves on expenses, you might be on the losing end of a really bad trade-off. Whatever the reason, you need to monitor this and redirect sellers back to selling activities. Here's a very simple formula, a helpful guideline to get you thinking about this. It is Deb's #1 rule of selling, and that is effort equals opportunity. Effort equals opportunity. How much effort do you want your sellers to put into a task? Well, it depends on the opportunity. If it's a huge opportunity, of course you want your seller to monitor that, to spend more time with that, to invest wisely in working with other departments to get all the resources allocated that need to be. If it's a smaller opportunity, maybe it doesn't require as much. Your sellers should know that there are different tiers of proposals that they might put together. Putting all of the effort in for a small sale that you do for a big sale just isn't going to make your sellers efficient. Okay, let's skip to #5. I'll come back to this formula, effort equals opportunity, but #5, this is another necessary and important part of a sales job, being able to provide customer service, being able to sometimes provide technical service or service that goes beyond selling. But it's also one that needs to be kept in balance. And this is probably a little difficult for some sellers to sort out because customer care is, after all, a very important part of selling. But you know it's out of balance. You know it's out of balance if a seller's hanging out with customers versus selling and serving those customers when they meet. And you know it's out of balance if the seller is accepting continuances and is spending a lot of time on unproductive check-ins that don't advance the sale. And you know it's a little bit out of balance if the seller's calling on the same few customers over and over again instead of having an appropriate mix of old and new. Some other things that can happen when a seller is spending too much time, too high of a focus on even customer service, it's if they are donning their superhero cape, if they have superhero syndrome, if they are constantly in reactive mode, having to come in and be the hero to save the sale, to save the something. Instead of being reactive, how can you help a seller be more proactive? How can you eliminate the problems that are causing them to have to fly in to save the situation? Whatever they're doing to put out the fire, I can just about guarantee that solving that problem proactively so that that problem is avoided, that's going to take less time. It's going to result in happier customers and more stable relationships. It's going to reduce the stress, and it's going to enable sellers to spend more quality time selling. Think about drive time, too. I work with a lot of sellers on just trying to make their days more efficient. So many sellers, at the drop of a hat, will jump in their car to go call on a customer instead of taking care of something by phone or email, or by waiting until the next day when they're already going to be in the neighborhood. This reactionary mode is not what needs to happen. Customers actually don't really expect it. I interview buyers. Buyers are not always needing to have an immediate reaction. They're not unreasonable about this. So an explanation, a question to find out about the level of urgency, and an appropriate response to manage and protect your own time, that's what sellers should feel enabled to do. And when they do get in the car, when they've got that windshield time, think about ways that they could maximize that time. Can they listen to podcasts? Are they set up to have an ability to talk as they're driving? What is it that they can do to make sure that the time they spend behind the wheel is quality time too? They're on the clock. It's not unreasonable to ask for it. What we're looking for with everything here is to be able to strike a balance. Inside your organization, set some standards. Figure out what works best. What are your top sellers doing that others could replicate when it comes to percent of their workday? What percent is it that's buyer-facing time? If you're leaving it up to the individual seller's discretion, then you're sending the message that it's okay for it to be higher when they're in the mood, when they've got the mojo, when they're feeling it, and it's also okay for it to be lower when they just don't feel like selling that day. Setting standards creates an expectation. It's a metric. It's something you can measure and coach around, and it helps especially your new sellers who are coming in to understand what it takes to be successful. Okay, now we have already, this last and sixth culprit, we've already touched on this just a little bit in the other five, but I needed to make a separate call out here so we could zero in on a few unproductive and even counterproductive practices. One really unprofitable sales effort is the misuse of social media and email. I suggest that you clock your reps on the percent of their time spent on spammy messages that diminish your brand. I've done this with two sellers in recent weeks, and in both cases, over half the day was spent like this on ineffective, in fact, I'll go so far as to say embarrassing messaging to prospects. Complete waste of time to send even one of those, let alone to be spending 4 or 5 hours a day on sending that garbage out. So watch that. Don't let it happen. Other sorts of things that are just not very strategic, they're unprofitable. It's this notion that you should never abandon a prospect. That's not true. You want your sellers to cut out continuances, to put an end to pending, and to stop stalling out. Stop celebrating the fact that a buyer hasn't yet said no. No is a good thing. It liberates you to go on to others who might be yeses. I'm just not a fan of the Pollyanna view that every lead is a prospect. Qualification includes accessibility. It's not a qualified buyer if you can't get an answer or you can't get time with that buyer. And that brings me back to our formula. Right? Effort equals opportunity. Give up or park it until a future date if that opportunity is no longer proportionate to the effort. Jeb Blunt ends one of his books with the question, how badly do you want it? If the answer is that you don't want it very badly, well, stop wasting your time. Reallocate that time, dedicate that time to prospects that you really, really want, to selling efforts that will really, really have an impact. Last but not least, we really can't sufficiently address these culprits of lost selling time without tackling the myth of multitasking. Let me point out that there is an attachment about this. It's an infographic. There's also a whole other webinar about this on my channel here. So if this is something that you'd like to spend a little more time thinking about or educating your sellers about, please take advantage of those particular resources. There is a professor at Cornell University. His name is Dr. Mike Hotstetler. And he quotes a study he did that I think is very revealing. They measured people who were multitasking. They measured them for their effectiveness, And they found that people who were multitasking were as capable, relative to not multitasking, they were as capable as people who were blowing a .08 blood alcohol level, which is illegal for driving in most states. So why do we want people to be multitasking? Why do we place this priority, this value on multitasking? I can't tell you how many ads I see, recruiting ads for salespeople who say, must be a good multitasker. Frankly, there's no such thing as a good multitasker. In fact, research tells us that there are less than 3% of the population that can actually even do multitasking well. They're called supertaskers. And the rest of us, well, we're just part of the problem. We are part of this very, very big problem that is costing organizations in the U.S. $450 billion annually. That's measured in wasted time on rework, on inefficiency, on low quality, and on lost opportunities that come from trying to multitask, from buying into the myth that we should be able to do that. Here's a study that I think you'll find interesting. It took a look at the accuracy and the productivity, the output, of people who were high, medium, and low multitaskers. You'll notice that the lowest accuracy rate came with the highest multitaskers. The more you multitask, the more mistakes you make. The medium multitaskers, this is interesting, and this is where the myth comes from, they had the highest rates of output, of productivity. But, of course, their accuracy was still a problem. So they were putting out more work, but they were putting out more work of low quality. The low multitaskers had the highest accuracy and almost as high a productivity rate as those medium multitaskers. So if you'll just give up a little bit of output in order to significantly improve quality, which also, of course, reduces rework and makes your quality something that your customers will appreciate, right? If you'll just do that, you will find that you get a lot of time back in your day. Better quality, less rework, do it right the first time. Don't multitask. In sales, the quality of our activities has such a huge impact on our success. But when you multitask, you are 40% less productive, and you're making 50% more mistakes unless you're part of that elite 3% who are the super taskers. Not only that, but the high achievers in any field, not just sales, but any field, those are the people who have intense focus. When you're able to focus narrowly and singularly, you will get more done, you'll do it better, and research tells us you'll also have a higher level of job satisfaction. That means that your time is well spent and you're putting those other culprits, you're holding them at bay, putting them in check. So yeah, there's an infographic for all this. There are other webinars that you can tune into. We've covered a lot. This has been a whirlwind of different considerations when it comes to sales productivity. And there's a lot more where this came from. So if you are a seller who's looking for some help and you think that you might benefit from some sales coaching, or if you are a sales manager and you're wondering how to change your sales culture and your performance metrics and what you're asking people to do so that you can increase sales productivity, let me know. Let's find out what you can do to be able to keep these 6 key culprits of lost selling time at bay and truly enable sales effectiveness in your organization. With that, I'm open for a few questions. We've got a couple of minutes left here. I'm going to take one question. I appreciate you waiting because this was posted a while ago. That question is, what can I do myself? My manager forces me to do this kind of stuff. Yes, managers don't mean to. Let me just say that first and foremost. Managers don't fully understand what they're asking you to do. They aren't watching you every minute of every day. They're not seeing the strain this puts on you. So let's not hold it too much against sales managers. They're held up to do a lot of stuff too. But I think it's a frank conversation. Asking your sales manager, did you know this takes actually 3 hours every week? It's 3 hours that I'm not on the street selling. Or this takes even 10 minutes a day. That adds up too. That's almost an hour. By the time you refocus and get back to your other work, that's almost an hour out of every week. if you were to take that hour and reinvest it in selling, what would it yield for the organization? So break it down. I find that sales managers really do respond very well when they can see the cause and effect. And what you're asking your sales manager to do is to liberate more selling time so that you can make more sales. So be sure to position it that way, and then be sure to deliver on it. Don't get rid of the nuisance tasks only so that you can waste time in some other way. That's not fair. Any other questions? Okay, well, please do use all the attachments and take a look at the other webinars. To those who are here live, I really appreciate your participation. To those listening on demand, don't hesitate to be in touch. You've seen my email on every single slide or my website, and we're here to help. So People First Productivity Solutions, that's what we are all about.